Hello.
Hello.
Oh. Well, I must admit I'm in a state of flux. I mean, one moment I was where I currently reside, and now I'm sitting here in a garden with two people that I've never seen before. And it makes me wonder how you managed to conjure me up. I know that this is an anniversary year, right? We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and it was actually this month in August when that happened. So maybe that was the conduit that you were able to use. And that actually sort of bubbles up memories for me, just thinking about that 19th Amendment and what the efforts that we put into getting that passed. And so if the two of you are willing, I don't know what your plan was, but if the two of you are willing, maybe we could go back in time and talk about some of that. I see that someone provided notes for us because certainly, my memory's a little foggy. Um, but yes, let's do that. So let's introduce ourselves because obviously we've never met before. I'm thinking you know who I am because you had a plan to bring me here, but just in case you summoned the wrong person, I will let you know that I am Carrie Clinton Chapman Catt. And I was born in 1859 in Ripon, Wisconsin. But eventually I became a resident of New York State. Are we in New York State? Okay, so I'm sort of back in a way, back to my home state. For all of my life, I was a peace activist. And for a good part of my life, I was very active in the women's suffrage movement. And with an army of other women, we were able to get suffrage for American women, national suffrage. Once the 19th Amendment was passed, I founded the League of Women Voters. But prior to that, I served twice as president of NASA, which was the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So we could talk about the League, we could talk about NASA, we could talk about all of those things. But before we do, I would love to know who the two of you are. Now, you do not have to reveal your birth year, such as I did. Once you get to be over 100 years old, you become proud of that fact. But tell me who you are.
I'm Patricia Nugent, and I've been a student of the women's suffrage movement and an unabashed feminist for many decades. And I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be in your presence. I'm interested too in how you got here, but I feel such a deep personal connection to the women who came before me, who opened up opportunities for other women. So thanks for all your hard work and thanks for showing up today. As a student of the suffrage movement, I have written a play about a modern-day reunion of the founding suffragists called The Stone That Started the Ripple, and they come back today, just like you did, and comment on what's going on today. And I also am the editor of a book called Before They Were Our Mothers, Voices of Women Born Before Roses Started Riveting. I also developed and I teach a feminist history course called Making Money. So maybe that's what qualified me to be here. I don't know. I'm just delighted.
Well, I'm Stacy Lombardi, and perhaps it was me who summoned you. Somebody recently asked me, who would you sit on a park bench with to talk to and to learn more about? And I mentioned your name. So maybe that was me. I'm going to take full responsibility.
You can take credit.
But I'm so happy that you were able to come and join us. I am a wife and a mother of two daughters. My eldest daughter is a sophomore in college in Boston, and she is a strong activist, similar to you. And my youngest daughter is a sophomore in high school, and perhaps my oldest daughter gets a lot of her activism. Is that a word?
It can be.
Yeah, it can be. Because I consider myself an activist, especially now for social and racial equalities.
Yes, well, thank you. So lovely to meet both of you. I'm thinking I'm going to go way back in time. I'm going to go way back in time to when I was just a couple of years younger probably than your younger daughter. I was 13 years old. and it was a presidential election day. And as I came downstairs and entered the kitchen, I noticed that my mother was in her everyday dress, while my father and the hired men were dressed in their Sunday best. And so I asked, "Mother, you're not going to town dressed like that, are you? And aren't you going to vote for Mr. Greeley?" Well, all the adults laughed, including my mother. And I felt both bewildered and embarrassed. We had had many very heated political discussions around the dining room table, but never once was the subject of women not being able to vote ever brought up. So my mother went on to explain that women only could vote in the Grange and in church. And that was the first time in my life when I was made to feel inferior to men in some manner. And it started a chain of thought that rankled me and actually sort of propelled me to be more active in the women's suffrage movement to help women get the vote. And so now women do have the vote. They've had it for 100 years almost. But I do wonder if women still think of how important the vote is. I mean, we knew the reasons why, but I wonder if they're still holding on to that. So I'm curious to know, like, what are your thoughts on voting?
Well, voting is, for me, I was an active voter since I turned 18, which wasn't that many years ago. And I look at it as a woman that it's a way to get our voice out there as to what we need and what we want and what we truly, truly believe in. It's an important right in our democracy that we even have that right to vote. There are a lot of countries that aren't built on democracy. So yes, it's very important. And to get out there and vote and vocalize everything that we really want in our democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with the suffragists' initial message, your initial message, which was that the vote is the key to unlocking all other civil rights. It's really essential. And throughout our nation and actually around the globe, people have literally died for the right to vote. It is the basis of individual sovereignty, as you know, and it's the cornerstone of democracy. So for me, that always begs the question, why is there a history of voter suppression in this country, starting way back when, before your day, actually. And the voter ID requirements now that are sweeping the nation state by state are an excellent example of how we're making it harder for people to vote rather than easier. And especially the demographic that voter ID requirements target are those that would be a little more left-leaning in their political agenda. So why is it so hard, and I don't know if you have the answer to this, but why is it so hard for our leaders to listen to the voice of the people, to bend to their will? And that is what you went through your whole life.
Yes. Yes. Now, do you prefer Patricia or Pat?
Pat is fine.
And I shall call you Pat.
Okay.
So, Pat, it's very disturbing to hear that voter suppression is still an issue. I would have hoped that by now that was not the case. If we go back to us trying to obtain the vote for women, there was all sorts of ideas about why that shouldn't be the case. The science that substantiated opposition to women voting was supported by many people. And it had to do with the fact that there was a belief that we had inferior brains. And so we would have comments such as, well, if women cannot participate in voting because their inferior brains wouldn't be able to support that. Or if women use their inferior brains to be active politically, their health might suffer. And so it was very difficult to counteract some of those things, because people really strongly believe that. People believe that the body, the human body, had a finite amount of energy, and that women needed to channel that energy into their reproductive systems, which is what we were on Earth for, is to reproduce. That was our goal.
There are some who still believe that, by the way.
Oh my goodness, I would have hoped that that was debunked by now. It was actually a concern that if women were out voting and being politically active and thinking, that their ovaries would atrophy. So that was hard to overcome. That thinking was hard to overcome. And there was a whole volume of opinion that we had to overcome in order for women to get the vote. But I also want to mention at this point, I want to establish the fact that it wasn't one person or it wasn't one event that was successful or contributed to the fact that women actually obtained suffrage. It was a scarcely recorded army of anonymous women that for 7 decades held meetings, challenged their fathers and their husbands and their sons and their employers, often putting themselves in physical and economic jeopardy to do so. They are the unsung heroes of the suffrage campaign. So I wanted to just put that out there, that we remember them. And it's so true, Stacey, what you said. I'd not heard that before, that your vote is your voice. That's a good, simple way of putting it. Because if people are not exercising their right to vote, they're sort of self-silencing themselves, are they not? They are not actively participating in the government. And sometimes in where I currently reside, I think about suffrage movement, and I think about women, modern women today, going to the polls, and I wonder if we are talking in that other place, and I wonder if they're ever aware of the voices of those women of the past that got them to that place where they were able to vote. Social reform has been greatly impacted by the power of women joining together, and I know that from personal experience. I think back to my very first sort of official foray into the suffrage movement, the formal suffrage movement, and it was when I was living in Mason City, Iowa, and I learned that there was an amendment to the state constitution on the table allowing for women to have municipal suffrage. And so I gathered together a group of civic-minded women, and we canvassed the whole city of Iowa. We canvassed all of Mason City, getting signatures on our petition in support of that amendment. And it was passed. And because of our success, the Iowa Suffrage Association took note and invited me to their state convention. So that was my very first convention, formal meeting. And to be honest with you, I found it quite dull. Until a little sweet-faced woman in a lace cap got up to make a speech. And the determination and the music of her voice just enthralled me. And she talked about the changes that she had seen regarding women's rights in her lifetime. And when the meeting was over, I sought her out and I sat down with her and I plied her with questions and I listened with rapt attention. And that was my very first meeting with Lucy Stone. That name may sound familiar to you. And for the rest of our relationship, I certainly admired her, her dedication to the cause, to abolition, to women's suffrage, and she became a role model for me. Once you get me started talking, sometimes I have a hard time stopping. So I'm going to stop here, and because the idea or the subject of role models has come up, and so I'm wondering who your role models might be.
I'd like to look at our former First Lady, Michelle Obama. She has since she has stepped off from office, she has put together a lot of programs for children to mentor them, as well as putting together a series of podcasts. Podcasts are something new in our century here, where people are listening to pre-recorded messages, like voices, and they like put voices in their ears because they wear earplugs and they jog around neighborhoods listening to these voices. So she's put a lot of these podcasts together that are empowering women to stand up for their rights and to give them ideas that maybe the feelings that they're feeling inside aren't bad, they're good. So I looked up to her for a lot. But I also have to look up to my mother. My mother was a great influence on me. She taught me the value of family, the value of friendships, and she was also a very involved with her community, doing volunteer work and community outreach programs. And I feel like I am following her footsteps by doing the different community service work that I've been doing. Yeah.
There are so many, aren't there? So many women that we look to with gratitude. I would say my mom as well. My mom, in 1932, which was only 12 years after women got their right to vote, was the valedictorian of her high school class, and she made headlines in the Rochester, New York newspaper that when she declared that women's place is not in the home. And that was big news in 1932. I also would say Susan B. Anthony, who's a fellow native Rochesterian, is a significant role model for me. She was so brave, and as you talked about the economic jeopardy, the personal danger that these women were in, she was relentless. Unfortunately died before she saw women get the right to vote, but that's where you came in.
Yes. Yes, my mother was a role model for me as well. Thank goodness for our mothers, our strong mothers. And I'm trying to recall, because I would collect newspapers from all over New York State, and in the deep recesses of my mind, I think I read about your mother.
Oh my goodness.
I was still alive in 1932.
That's very neat.
And I think that perhaps I might have become a role model for certainly some of the younger women coming up through the ranks in the league because of my organizational skills. That was what I was very best at, and that actually gave me a leadership role in the League of Women Voters. When pressure mounted for me to run for the second time as president of NAWSACO, I have to admit that I did resist. At that point, I had kind of moved over into more of an international women's suffrage movement, and also we were gearing up for the referendum in New York to grant suffrage for women in New York State, and I knew that that was going to be, we had 2 years before that, in 1915, we weren't successful, and so we were hoping that this time we would be successful, and I knew that that was going to take a lot of work.
New York was very late to the party.
Yes, they were. Yes, they were. A lot of those opinions. But then I agreed, and I have to say that when I was elected, I did say to my board, I am an unwilling victim, and you all know it. But as is the case for me, once I'm in, I'm all in. So I started to build, the struggle to build was kind of a disjointed national organization so that we could be, the league could be more formidable and more effective and mobilize our army of 2 million. We had 2 million women who were members of the league at that time. And so we really did need to be organized, and we were successful. Now, once the 19th Amendment was passed, I had a concern about new voters, and so I founded the League of Women Voters to bring those formerly denied to them voters into the political mainstream and to educate them so that they would be, they would think about the candidates and exercising their right to vote, and it would be an informed decision. Now, Stacy, you claim to conjure me here, so I don't know if that's because you're both members of the League of Women Voters, if somehow that was the conduit. That's our connection in the universe. So I'm going to assume that at least you are, and perhaps you are too, Pat, members of the League of Women Voters.
Yes.
What prompted you to join the League?
You must be so proud of the organization that you founded. I have been a member for many, many years. When I was recruited, I knew almost nothing about the organization. And I was so pleasantly surprised to learn that they do so much more than candidate forums and voter registration. It's really a very comprehensive organization.
I'm fairly new to the organization. I came on board probably like 2-3 months ago. I was looking for a way to volunteer. With the presidential election coming up, I realized that there were a lot of folks out there who needed, especially women, needed to get out and vote, know who their candidates were. So I was just thinking, well, let me go and help with voter registrations. So I am part of that committee. And like Pat, once I opened the door, there is so much more than just voting. There are the educational programs for school-age children, for young adults. There's the political forums. And what I'm really excited about is this new committee that's just getting their feet going, dealing with diversity, equality, all right, you're gonna have to go back.
Just start from diversity and then you're good.
Diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So I'm really excited to be a part of that committee. Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Well, so it does sound like the League is still offering voter education, which was part of my original plan. But what you were saying, Pat, made me think, being hopeful and encouraged about the fact that the League is also looking at issues, social issues, is at that time I wanted the League to educate our voters on social issues, such as maternity and child care, and the Child Labor Act, which needed to be passed. And also hoping for equal pay for women so that they could become independent. Have we been successful with that?
We have not been successful with that.
Oh my goodness.
Still
All
way
these
to go.
years, women are still
It's a
not being
travesty.
paid equally. That is a travesty. Well, hopefully the two of you can do something about that.
We're on it.
Yeah.
And I also wanted to make sure that the League, we were united, but we never degenerated into supporting or endorsing any one political candidate. Because I think that the hypocrisy of politicians, I mean, it never ceases to amaze me. And I can speak candidly about that now because I'm not currently in society, where certainly I had to walk a fine line back when we were trying to gain the vote. But politics can be a dirty business, and so I'm glad that we remain nonpartisan. So now that you're both members of the League, and I'm wondering if you take a more active role, like are you on committees? What's your level of participation?
Well, like I had said, I was just coming on board to work at a voter registration event. And somehow I got sucked in, not that I was being sucked in. I'm on the committee for the National Voter Registration Day, which is coming up in September. So we are very, very active in getting tables set up at various organizations and locations, making sure that everyone knows about their right to vote, how to register, where their polling places may be. And this presidential election coming up is quite unique, so maybe answering a lot of questions they may have. So I'm actively involved with that, and again, looking forward to this new committee that I'm going to help work on as well, dealing with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusivity, which is a very passionate area for me with my family dynamic.
For many years, I confess, I was simply a dues-paying member. I sent in my money, nice organization. But when I retired, I became more active, and I was recruited to join the board. I swear they have a tickler file so they know when someone retires, and then you get a phone call.
Oh, that's
It's kind
possible.
of like AARP.
I had tickler
It's
files.
like AARP calling you, getting the magazine the minute you turn 50. So I joined the board, and then I was president for 2 years when Barb Thomas stepped down from long-term leadership. And that was very scary because although Barb's feet are very small, her shoes were huge to fill. She's very formidable, I would say, in that role. But I haven't been on the board for many years now, but I take on special projects, and I really appreciate how the board has supported my interest in feminist history and in social justice types of things. That play I mentioned a little while ago about a reunion of your predecessors. They helped showcase that, and that's a pretty neat thing when you come to think of it. That a member can bring a good idea to the board and have them support you and help bring it to fruition.
Wonderful. And are they also supporting the course you mentioned earlier too? What was the
They
name of
are.
that
We
course?
received a grant at Making Waves. It's a retrospective on feminist history, and they are also supporting that. So I'm really grateful to how comprehensive and inclusive they are.
It's very nice to
Yes.
hear. You mentioning your play, and earlier Susan B. Anthony, who is a role model we both share, reminds me of kind of a funny story about Miss Anthony and I. Prior to the 1895 suffrage convention in Atlanta, Miss Anthony and I went on a 1-month tour of 5 states in the Deep South. And as you can imagine, it was sometimes uncomfortable and sometimes exhausting. It was very warm, but Miss Anthony never complained. She was a soldier, for sure. Now, we had an agreement that Miss Anthony would lead the meeting, and she would talk, and if there was any time left, then I would fill in the time that was left. Now, if Miss Anthony had a strong cup of coffee for dinner, I could count on her for 30 minutes. But if that wasn't the case, maybe 5 minutes, which meant I always had to be on my toes and ready to be able to speak. But one of the things I liked best about that travel was that what we shared together really further connected us and made our friendship much more intimate than it had been. And it's so nice to hear that in addition to education, the League is supporting its members and ideas and perhaps going in directions that were never planned because of the ideas and of its members, which is just so wonderful to hear. So it sounds like it's still an important element in society. And can you tell me a little more about that?
Sure. I think the League is very influential with the educational programs. I'm hearing, especially with the younger adults, that they are eager for change. They're getting out there and voicing their opinions. There have been a lot of demonstrations going on. They want change from the leadership from the top down. They want change. They are talking loudly against police brutality. They're talking loudly about social and racial injustices. And what they need to know, like you were doing in your protest, is let your voice be heard. But they need to realize that, yes, this is good, but their voice needs to be their vote. They need to get to the polls this fall. So all the educational programs that are available, especially for school-age children, getting them to realize, like, okay, by voting, this is a method that what I feel someone's going to hear and be part of who's going to be our school board leader, who's going to be our representatives on the state level as well as the federal level. So I think getting to the younger voters early, with educating them, bringing young. I think there is a program, and Pat, correct me if I'm wrong. There's a program where you bring your child to the polls to have the parents be an influence. Like, this is how we do it.
And
This
the
is
kids
important.
drag parents to the polls because they want the
That
little stickers,
sticker,
right?
right. Because I remember in my childhood, we lived in a very rural area. So election night was a holiday for us. It was a family night out. Mom and Dad would get dressed up, clean up. Off we go to, I don't know, it was the Grange Hall. We would see our neighbors. We would vote. I wouldn't vote, but I would watch. And then later we would go downstairs and there was a potluck dinner. So it was a night out. So just keeping people familiar that this is what we need to do. This is part of our democracy. This is our right to let our voices be heard.
One thing I really love about the League is that for me and for so many others, it allows me to do one-stop shopping about the issues I care about. So whether it's healthcare or reproductive health or social justice or economic justice, public education, gun control, pay equity, the League is involved and has positions on all of those and advocating for those. And you mentioned about it being nonpartisan. The real beauty of that is that it allows people who are on the same side of an issue, no matter what the political leanings are, to work together on an issue. And I think we need that now more than ever because our constituency is so polarized out there. And I know League members from 3 different political parties. That's pretty amazing in an organization that's concerned with voting rights, voter education, and educating the public.
Well, I'm very happy to hear, Pat, that the League has remained nonpartisan, because I think that's really important for us to have an impact in society, and not turn people away or have people turn a deaf ear to what we have to say. And Stacy, it's so nice to hear about the young people, because I think that the League, certainly for however long we exist, we need leaders of all ages so that we have a more diverse opinions and energy. Young people have more energy than we do, and often they're more passionate. So those are good things. When I formed the League, the one thing I was not going to do was be president of the League of Women Voters. So I convinced Maud Wood Park to take on that leadership role, and I chose her because I knew that based on her experience in the suffrage campaign, that she would be able to inspire and fold into the League members of all diverse backgrounds and ages that would give us a very good base to build upon. At that point in time, I'd like to say that, I think that the League represented a new age in the inexperienced era of women being able to vote. This was new for everyone, for society in general. And I wanted women to learn to use their ballots fearlessly and with intention. And that was what I was hoping the League would help them do. So here we are, women have been granted suffrage, and I can kind of be off the hook and sit in my garden in Juniper Hill, and I didn't do that. I became very active back into the peace movement, because war is my greatest woe. And so I threw myself tirelessly back into the peace movement, hoping to eradicate war globally. That was my intention.
Ms. Catt, were you a Quaker?
No, I was not. So that being said, that was a very formidable journey for me, because as you know, war has an economic level to it too. So it isn't just people battling things out. So it's very hard to completely eradicate war. And as you know, I was not successful. in that. One of the things that really concerned me was in 1933, a man named Adolf Hitler started to rise to power in Germany. And we heard what was happening in that country. So I organized a group of non-Jewish American women to formally protest how Jews were being treated in Germany. And we sent a letter to Hitler that decried those acts of violence and inhumane treatments toward German Jews. We had 9,000 signatures on that letter of non-Jewish American women. And I never did hear anything about that, but I imagine the more I learned about Adolf Hitler, the more I realized that that letter was probably thrown and laughed at and thrown in the trash. So
Still tried.
well, we tried, and that I guess that's like an important point: is that we must speak out. We must say, we must speak out for what we think is as important, because that action in itself is a successful action, regardless of the outcome. But it wasn't just Jewish people. I mean, I think all people need to be treated with respect and treated equally.
I was reading an interesting article the other day with the Iowa State University. That's your alma mater, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very nice. Did you realize that they recently named a building after you? The Carrie Chapman Catt Center for Women in Politics. And do you recall the old Botany building? It was a center.
Oh, most certainly, yes.
Well, they demolished and renovated it and also named it after you.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's a great honor,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
yes.
Also in this article, it was interesting because it's honoring you, but at the same time, they were mentioning that there was a lot of controversy around naming these buildings after you, dealing with the remarks that you had made about people of color. I'm curious now, what are your views on racism and the role of the African American women in your suffrage movement?
Well, my first thought is that it's not very often that people get to come back from the dead to make amends. And so, Stacy, I appreciate that question. Well, I firmly believe that this country would not be as strong as it could be unless every single adult, regardless of race, color, creed, had their inalienable and unpurchasable voice in government. While I believe that, I sometimes did not stick to that moral code when it came to the suffrage movement. We made decisions that we didn't always think about those decisions impacting other people in the organization. Our desire to wear white clothing, women, the suffragists wore white as a sort of uniform. And looking back, perhaps that was a subtle message to women of color in the movement, that white was the predominant color. White was the stronger color. We won't know the answer to those things unless we have conversations, which I assume you're having in your committee. That's part of that process. I consider myself a woman of integrity, a woman of integrity, and I have a genuine commitment to the struggle for women's rights of all denominations. But that being said, as a means to an end, I passively ignored segregation in the South. I was concerned that if we outwardly rallied against or protested against racism or segregation, that it would hold back the suffrage movement. And my ultimate goal was that once we got the vote, we could fix those things. We would be able to fix those things. And I'm thinking that the comment that people found disturbing was when I was asked by Southern gentlemen about, well, not asked so much as addressing a concern that they had, that African American women would be able to vote, which was not something that they wanted to happen, I suggested that they could continue to regulate suffrage in whatever manner they had been doing for African American men since the 15th Amendment had been passed. And I have to say that I recall that remark with shame.
Well, hopefully we've learned so much in examining ourselves.
That would be my hope. That would be my hope. And so what I'd like to do is just sort of bring out names of women that my heart swells with gratitude for, that I knew some and others I only knew of, like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett. Those African American suffragists and abolitionists, they advocated for the vote even though they were sometimes spurned by their white counterparts. And they were as committed to suffrage as we were. But sometimes their voices were silenced or marginalized. And they had sometimes more responsibilities with wage earning and domestic duties that they were able to overcome in order to dedicate themselves to the movement. And they had two obstacles to overcome: race and gender. They advocated for all of their lives to end slavery, the earlier women, and then to gain citizenship for African Americans and to ensure for them the right to vote. So this conversation makes me think of something that maybe, because I don't have any input into current society, that I could count on the two of you to make sure that these women are long remembered for their accomplishments. That would be wonderful if you could do that.
They are included in my course.
Well,
Makes you
that
feel better.
that is
That's
so
guilty.
good to hear, because until there's equity in all areas of our nation, we are less of a nation. And we must continue to protest, to speak out, we've said, to unify and to organize. Those are the things we need to continue to do. Yes.
And I really do appreciate you stepping back and being honest and giving us the gusto to go forward. So just let you know that even though the African Americans were really regretfully not part of the league, Pat and I in the league are really trying to make it more of a diverse organization. We're actively working to change the perceived perception to be more diverse. As we continue to grow our movement, we acknowledge our history, and we vow to include the voices of those that weren't originally allowed to come to the table to speak. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the committees that is just getting a foothold, and we on the committee are learning ourselves, and then we're going to be involving more of our community to see how to do this. So I know I will have you in my heart as we go forward. Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
this is one of the reasons why I summoned you, just to hear, and it makes me feel better knowing that you purposely were not making those remarks, that there was a reason behind it.
Yes. There was a reasoning behind it, but it's also important to, I learned, is to think before one opens your mouth.
We all can learn that
Sometimes.
lesson.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's so wonderful to hear. I mean, we cannot change the past, but we always have the opportunity to do better going forward, right? Do better going forward. I cannot tell you what an enjoyable conversation this has been, meeting both of you. And I'm privileged. Well,
Yes.
thank you. Thank you for saying that. So I'm thinking that maybe we should sort of wind things down and maybe end with just two more areas of conversation or questions. And I've been asking a lot of the questions. So I'm going to turn the tables and ask if you have a question of me, Carrie, something that you would, you were saying you would like to sit on a park bench with me. And so what would be a question that you might ask me?
I'd like to stick with the topic of diversity. When Alice Paul, I cringe when you hear her name a little bit, but when she rose to a leadership position in your organization, there were many who considered her too radical, too impulsive, too militant for those who had been working on this project for quite a while. And that split your organization into again. And today we deal with differences, generational differences in style. So even though people who are on the same side of an issue might be at odds because they have a different approach. And two modern day people who come to mind for me are both in the House of Representatives. One's Nancy Pelosi and one is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. On the same side of the issue, but often have a different approach. So since the League is struggling to have a more diverse demographic and especially to reach younger people these days, I'm wondering if what you might have done differently when you reflect back with Alice Paul instead of letting it polarize and split your organization. Any advice for us going forward?
Well, Pat, I have to say I'm not familiar with Nancy Pelosi or Miss Cortez. And I could speak sort of general terms. What I believe that I've learned from those experiences with Alice is that as we age, as we move forward in life, we can learn things if we're paying attention. And that I think it's very important to listen to what people are saying. And then if we are in the same organization, we must focus on our commonalities rather than our differences, and let that be our strength. And for myself, not letting my ego get in the way of perhaps accepting and understanding or listening to another person's strategy that I might not have considered, but may very well be quite impactful. And once we establish our commonalities, then we want to unite around those commonalities because we will always be stronger when united rather than splintered.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a good question. I'm just curious, after our discussion here, what is bringing joy to your heart to see your vision, how you formed the League, and as to where we are today?
Stacy, it's so nice to hear that the League is sort of following my plan of educating voters and lobbying for social reform and social justice. And as far as the League going forward into the future, I have no trepidation whatsoever based on my conversation with the two of you. You are excellent League members, and if you're representing the other League members right now, yes, my pride will continue in the League. When I think of the word joy, I have to think for a minute of how that word joy incorporated into the movement. Certainly over time, during different campaigns, there were moments of joy when we had success in a state, and then moments of despair if we did not. When I think about the first time that I was elected to serve as president of NAWSA, the National American Women Suffrage Association, I was replacing Miss Anthony as president. And as you mentioned, Pat, with your situation, Miss Anthony did have tiny feet, but her shoes were huge. So I looked at that as joyful, but also I had trepidation about taking on that role. And at the convention, when the results of the election were announced, at first there was thunderous applause on my behalf, which felt good and joyful in a way, but then there was a hush. The whole auditorium quieted down, a complete hush in the auditorium, and we were unified in our thought that we are all witnessing the same thing, the passing of Miss Anthony as our president. And those of us who had worked closely with her, while we tried to contain ourselves, we simply wept. We wept openly. but there was joy intermingled in those tears. Yes, thank you for helping me to remember that because of the emotion involved.
Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome. Last question I'm going to ask the two of you is one more question about the League of Women Voters. And this is an opportunity to perhaps say, what do you think the League could to do better going forward? What are changes maybe the League needs to make, or your visions for the future?
That was a tough question, seeing that I'm relatively new and really don't know what is all involved.
Yes.
But I really,
You can still have a vision.
yes, I really strongly believe that we need to educate the younger voters. I really like the programming, just getting them more involved in themselves, making the league more diverse is what I really would like to see going forward. Come back in a few months, I'll summon you back.
When it's cooler, I hope.
The election day.
After
Oh
election.
my goodness,
Yes,
that could be
yes.
interesting.
Yes, yeah, just young adults, they want the change, and just guide them in how their voice can be heard.
Your organization is 100 years old. How many organizations have that kind of longevity? So congratulations.
It's still going strong.
It's a pretty amazing organization, and you know, I used to think there were legions of people working on every project, every activity, but it turns out really there's usually a handful or two who are making things go, and it does so much already. I mentioned that I served as president. I only did that 2 years because I was exhausted. It is so demanding and dynamic an organization with so many different stakeholders, and I really love that it's become even more forceful now in its lobbying and its advocacy, and even in its protesting. The kinds of infractions that go against the type of stands that the league takes on social justice or economic or environmental issues. My only suggestion would be for the league to look for more ways to engage members. It kind of goes along with what Stacy was saying about looking at a more diverse grouping, but there's a few people carrying a lot of responsibility, and it's important for people who join an organization to feel there's a place for them, and I can contribute in some way. Like Stacy said, she has found her niche, kind of. So, you know, I couldn't be more proud to be a member and to be an advocate for your organization, but there's still so much to do, and we need all hands on deck.
Well, I don't think of it as my organization. I think of it as our organization, right? And those are very good points to make. Perhaps the younger people, by engaging younger people, then they would take a more active role. And it's always helpful to sort of diversify the duties in an organization so that we don't wear people out. That is not what we want. So to go forward with this evolution of the league, I'm actually thinking of an old saying. It's a very old saying, and it may not have survived its way into this century, but it was something that we would use quite often. And incorporated into this saying is a possible slogan for you and other league members going forward. And the saying goes like this: because a nail was lost, the shoe was lost. Because the shoe was lost, the horse was lost. Because the horse was lost, the rider was lost. And because the rider was lost, the battle was lost. And all because of a horseshoe nail. So I'm thinking that going forward, you must be the nails in this campaign. You and other league members. It's a very special place. And your duty is to ensure that there is equity and diversity and inclusion in the league and really in the nation. And the league could be the guide toward that happening. and ensuring that people exercise their right to vote and making that as important as it possibly can be in many ways, presenting it in many ways so that each person, each voter can hear that message. We need to do this because the world is bringing us closer and closer together every day and every year. And so that is your slogan. You are the nail in the horseshoe. I cannot thank you enough, Stacy, for summoning me here today.
Thank you, Stacy.
And conversating with me, the two of you. It's been so lovely. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for bringing the league forward into the future and maintaining its strength and its importance. Thank you again.
Thank you.
You're welcome.